Hi everyone, I'm Professor Geyer, in case you haven't met me, and today we are going to talk more about asking scientific questions. At this point, you have already been in lab and you have worked with our organisms in lab, and you've made some observations and asked some questions about them. So we're going to dive a little deeper into some ways to ask scientific questions. So, as an important part of science is investigating, understanding, and developing explanations for whatever you are studying, whether it's the Earth, the universe, systems. Here we're doing biology, so how all of the different organisms and how they interact together, how all of that works. And investigation is built from scientific questions. So that's why coming up with scientific questions is such an important part of science. So, before we can come up with scientific questions, though, we need to tackle an idea of what is science. And you already thought about this in lab already when you were trying to decide if your questions and your observations were scientific. Could they be answered using science? And the ultimate goal of science is to explain the natural world. So, when you're trying to explain the natural world, there are scientific questions, and there are questions that fall outside the realm of science. So, hopefully, you said some things about scientific questions, like they are limited to explanations that are based in nature, meaning the opposite of supernatural. So, it cannot involve ghosts or fairies or elves. It's got to be about nature. It has to be observable. It has to be testable. Um, Other things about scientific questions, they have to rely on evidence. It's not just someone's opinion. You actually have to do an experiment. You have to gather evidence. There has to be information to help support your ideas. So, scientific questions and questions that fall outside of science are important to remember so that when we're asking questions in science, we stick with our scientific questions. So, one introductory biology book defined science as an experimental, hypothesis driven investigation of phenomena to elucidate patterns in nature and the processes governing the formation, maintenance, and changing of those patterns. So, in science, we want to look for these patterns, but we've got to have, as you see in this definition, experiments. We've got to have hypotheses. We have to be able to do an investigation, and it's going to be in our natural world. So, explaining our natural world means we're going to be working with cause and effect. And maybe you already started to think about cause and effect as you were thinking about what science is. Science is trying to figure out what causes the things that we see in the world. So, answering these kinds of questions about cause and effect is incredibly important and leads to some of our huge ideas in science. So, we're going to focus for the next few minutes about this idea of cause and effect. Not every part of science is about cause and effect, but a large part of it is. So today we're gonna study that a little bit. So to start off, just to make this a little easier and not quite so scary, some people are really afraid of making scientific questions or think that it's really hard to come up with a good scientific question. So, just to get your creative juices flowing, let's, for a few minutes, talk about some synonyms. What else could we say besides cause? Or what else could we say besides effect? So I actually want you to stop and think for a few minutes. What are some other words for cause? What are some other words for effect? Since you're doing this at home, you could even use a thesaurus if you have one laying around or on your phone or something. But really try to come up with some ideas for cause and some ideas for effect. So I came up with some of words for cause and effect. So this is my list. So some synonyms for cause that I came up with: origin, stimulation, driver, generator, motive, agent, force, factor, actor, source, basis. You might have come up with some other ones, as long as these are all synonyms for cause. And then we've got effect. So effect could be the end, the consequence, the response, the aftermath, pattern, conclusion, outcome, reaction. So you probably came up with even some other ones. So now we've got some other ideas for things that could be a cause and things meaning effect. So now we're going to jump to English. Just for a moment, you're probably thinking, what? This is science. But just for a moment, think about English. What kind of words are cause and effect? So, cause and effect are the subject and the object. So, if we're going to make a sentence, what type of word connects subjects to direct objects? This isn't that hard. We're looking for verbs. So, in case you were wondering what was that middle column for, we're now going to think of some verbs that can link all of those synonyms for cause and effect. It doesn't have to directly link the one in the row, because I didn't put them in any sort of order, but just what kind of verbs could link some of these ideas of cause and effect. And this is going to be our third ingredient in your question. So I do want you to think about what are some of these words, some of these verbs that we could use. So take a few minutes. What are some of your verbs? So here are some of my verbs. And again, not in any particular order. Hopefully you came up with some other ones. So some verbs: alters, generates, increases, decreases, stimulates, regulates, suppresses, controls, causes, leads to. So all of these different verbs and many, many more could link some of these ideas of cause and effect. So all we have to do is take our cause and our effect and link it with a verb, and we can come up with some great questions. So let's try it out. So here we have a list of different organisms: shark, grouper, seagrass, brain coral, crab, and plankton. And I want you to just pick one. And I want you to come up with a research question that includes the organism. Now, the organism could be your cause or your effect, your choice, but you're going to come up with a question. So maybe I'm going to pick seagrass. And maybe my question is, how does ocean acidification, so the ocean's becoming more acidic, how does ocean acidification impact seagrass growth? It had a subject, that cause, and an effect, and it had a verb. So ocean acidification and seagrass growth, and I'm asking about the impact. So I want you to take a minute, or lots of minutes, pick an organism, and I want you to come up with a question. And your question is going to have this cause, this effect, and a verb. All right, so let's think about your questions now that you have come up with some questions. What happens if you switch the cause and the effect? Do you end up with a different question? So remember, my question was, how does ocean acidification impact seagrass growth? If I switch the cause and the effect, then I get the question, does seagrass growth impact ocean acidification? It's a different question. It would involve a different experiment. What if we changed one of the words? What if I said, just does the presence of seagrass impact ocean acidification. So not if the grass grows or not, but just is it there or not? Again, a slightly different research question, and you would approach it differently in your experiment. So, different questions or recipes, investigations are formed if we just change some of the words in our sentence. So, some small changes can drastically change your investigation. So, coming up with a recipe is not so hard. You all have just done it. You all have just come up with some questions that could be great questions that you could go on to do research about. So, formulating a question that supports this recipe for investigating relationships between cause and effect is also important in communication. And science communication is one of the things we're going to study this semester. So, you're now going to go to the next Moodle activity and you're going to look at a list of journal titles. These are scientific journal titles, and you're going to evaluate them. You're going to see if you can just pick out the cause and the effect in some of these different scientists' titles. So try that out. It's the next activity in Moodle, and see how well you are doing.